Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name is Nesh Nikolic, and today's guest is Gaj Ravichandra, who is a recognized high-performance coach and psychologist. He has a wealth of experience looking at resilience and mental toughness, and he's worked with global organizations, government departments, educational institutions, sporting teams, and many others in looking at how to get the best and most out of people, pivoting, changing careers, and the like. So wealth of experience to draw on. I hope you really enjoy this episode because I found it very intriguing, especially looking at the different layers of what resilience actually is and how it might play out in different contexts. Enjoy. Gaj, a big thank you, and appreciate you coming onto the show today to talk about that mental toughness, building resilience space. I know that's, being a fellow psychologist yourself, but also someone with great experience in the space of, performance and, executive delivery in terms of, how to get the most out of teams and ourselves and working collaboratively and all the other different sort of features of work that you do. It's amazing to have you on the show.
It's great to be here, Nesh. Thank you. Loving what you do, mate, as well. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Look, something that is interesting always for me is this space around resilience, mental toughness. It's a word that we flick around, we throw around. It's fairly poppy, it's catchy these days as well. But in some sense, I've got an idea of what I think it is, but I'm kind of interested in finding out how you define it, or the people that you've worked with, because I know that's a space that you work in a lot. How is this defined? What does it mean? What is it?
Yeah, so there's seems to be a lot of words around, right? Whenever we do these kind of workshops, for example, around resilience and mental toughness, one of the things that we do is a quick word association exercise, right? And everyone just shouts out the different terms that they come across. So we get words like resilience and grit and, all those kind of things coming up. A sort of standard sort of textbook definition would be around being able to deal with pressure and challenges regardless of the environmental conditions that you're in, right? And being able to manage that. And I think that definition has kind of evolved, particularly over the last 20 years. If you look at the research and what's coming particularly out of Europe and the UK and the States, where a lot of this research is being driven, we tend to find that it's also not just about persisting and getting things done, but it's also about knowing when to slow down, right? And to kind of appreciate those elements that, we don't have to keep going for this win every time. And mental toughness is not about pushing ourselves to some extreme limit to the point of breaking, right? And then magically knowing when you're about to break and then just sort of putting on the handbrake. So it's also having those moments. And look, I think the Olympics, that we've just been going through are an amazing opportunity for us to see that, whether you are a sports person or not, whether you look at Simone Biles, you look at Naomi Osaka, and even if you go back to some of the greats of Michael Jordan, right, in the 1990s, his retirement, where he actually said to us, he gave us the clues around mental health. We didn't necessarily attach it to that, but he said, I just need some time, right? Now, everyone kind of thinks, well, when Michael says, I just need some time, he just wants to go play baseball, right? And that's what everyone considers. But actually, he needed a mental health break. That's what he needed. His father had passed away. He'd kind of won multiple championships. He was lost, right? And, we see this all the time. So I think that definition has evolved, and I think it's been changing over time. Yeah.
It's fascinating because, in so many ways, the word alludes to keep going, fight it through. And in many ways, it's probably often what the way that it's used and the way that it actually is intended as well. It's the resilience of keep going irrespective of what the environment is. And in another sense, what you're saying is there might be resilience in changing path of saying, I'm not going to keep doing that. That could be resilient because it goes against one's nature, it goes against one's grain. Like a lot of high achievers, the hardest thing to do is actually to step back.
Absolutely. And in fact, I was listening to one of your podcasts on one of the evolutionary biologists, one of the professors that you interviewed, and that fascinating concept of fight or flight, and then having this concept of freezing, where you get to take some time to think and reflect, and that is where real high performance kind of comes from, right? The opportunity that people take a time out to do those things. And if you imagine back in the days of us being cavemen and cavewomen, running around away from some sort of saber-toothed tiger and thinking that the only way to get out of this was to just keep running, commit to running, right? Rather than getting up a tree, right? Or thinking and reflecting. We don't have to go far, right? To kind of come up with different ideas and strategies and see the relevance of that. So yeah, it definitely feels like we are becoming clearer about, taking that time out and using the opportunities around us, and not just ourselves, but leaning on other people, right? I think that stigma of, I've got to do this myself. A high performer is someone who can rely on themselves to kind of get things done. But history is a great example that actually it starts with you, but you really do need other people around us. We are social creatures and we are interdependent. And so that sense, yeah.
How do we go out and try and explain something like the Naomi Osaka sort of situation with her sort of stepping back? And I want to kind of use this as a bit of an exploration because neither of us know. We don't know her. We don't know the actual story. But so we're going to have to make lots and lots of assumptions here. But how do we explain it? I mean, to me, looking from the outside, the way that I see it's been, like the story's been told, and this might not actually be the true story for Naomi, but at least from us onlookers, it looks like things got too tough for her or too difficult, that she's been under some type of pressure or she's met some difficulties in life which have got in the way of her being able to I suppose do all the elements of what's required of you to be a top performing tennis player. And I suppose the controversy there is doing interviews part of being a tennis player, irrespective, and maybe we can kind of discuss that a little bit further as well. But is she not resilient enough, or is this a resilience move? How do we unpack that? How do we explore that?
It's a good question. I don't think she would have achieved the level of success she's had in tennis if she wasn't resilient enough. And I think, probably to get to the point that she's gotten to, where millions of aspiring tennis players on a Saturday and Sunday morning. I mean, I grew up in Canberra. I mean, you're there at the moment. You know what it's like, -6 degrees, 7 o'clock in the morning. And, there are lots of people, aspiring to be where she got to. So there's an element of, she's demonstrated that. But I think beyond that, there is almost a sense of a combination of a few things. And this is just my sort of analysis on this situation, because there are some contradicting factors in her behavior that I find fascinating. So the first thing is that I don't think there are many athletes that like post-tournament interviews. Most people talk about it, particularly when you've lost. But I think the idea that, you have to go and after you've just had this massive adrenaline rush, the last thing you want to do is sit in front of a bunch of journalists and have to reiterate your story, right, about what you went through and what you were thinking and all the rest of it. So I think that's a pretty well standard accepted kind of process.
We even have one from Canberra as well, right?
What's that?
We have a Canberra tennis player that doesn't like that either.
Oh, yeah, I've heard. And so I don't think that Naomi Osaka or Nick are actually alone, right, in that. But what's interesting is that, I mean, she's clearly an introverted individual, right? And so what do we know about introverts? Well, they draw their energy from within. And so when they're in an environment where they are surrounded by immense noise that takes place, I mean, I'm sure you've been to a tennis tournament where you hear the kind of noise that exists. It is draining, right? The pre-match stuff you got to go through is draining. Then the press conference after is going to be draining, right? Now, that is all happening, and it is sucking energy out of an individual. So you see that on one side, and you sort of empathize and relate, right, to some form that could be hurtful. But then you see on the Instagram, Naomi Osaka probably posts a few times a day, right? She's got articles where she's being interviewed by Vogue magazine and various other publications, right? So there are other examples of her actually providing interviews, but perhaps it's happening one-to-one, it's happening on her terms, it's happening in contexts or environments that are completely different, right? And so this sense of even contextualizing where we might need to be resilient is really interesting. So for whatever reason, in our minds, for maybe Naomi's mind, she has contextualized that being in a press conference like that is actually really draining on me, right? And therefore, I don't want to do it. And if it's going to take away from my performance on the court, what is more important is that I deliver, because if I don't deliver on the court, no one's going to care about my Instagram feed. No one's going to care about my endorsements. No one's going to come to me and provide sponsorship, right? So, there is an interesting connection, I think, there around managing energy and knowing when enough is enough. And this came up in the Olympics a lot, right? After Simone sort of withdrew from some of the tournament there.
Can you explain who Simone is? I was going to say for the audience, but probably more so for me.
Absolutely. Well, Simone Biles is probably one of the most prolific American gymnasts on the planet. In fact, not just American, probably one of the most prolific gymnasts on the planet. In fact, LeBron James, who is probably one of the most well-known NBA players, arguably of all time behind Michael Jordan, came out a couple of years ago and said that she's probably one of the greatest athletes of all time in terms of her sport and just generally her mindset and dominance, right? And so she came out last week and actually pulled out of some of the events, saying that she mentally was pushing herself to the edge, right? And so she withdrew, and that was massive. That had never happened in the history of Simone Biles. People think and associate that kind of level of athlete with that kind of rigidity and toughness, right, in sort of your mindset. Now, she did come back and perform in one of the other events, but she took a timeout, basically, for herself, right? And what she said in an interview, ironically, a post-game interview, a post-performance interview, was that we almost need to start treating these sort of mental health gaps almost like if we had injured our knee, right? No one would be questioning if someone pulled a ligament, right, that you might need to take some time out. In the same way, if you do affect or damage your perception of your mind and how you treat the situation or the context, taking a time out is probably going to be healthy for you, right? And what we're taught to do is perhaps to persist and to keep going and to push through, right? Now, what happens when someone tears a hamstring, right? You don't just persist, you don't push through, you actually damage it even more, right? And so knowing when to pull back and having the people around you who will also support you to do that is really important. And so fortunately, Simone had that level of support as well. Though she was willing to push herself, there were people around her who were there to help her through that process. A bit of a tribe, if you like, to get her through that. So yeah, really fascinating, real-time scenarios.
What's really interesting for me is this space around context that you raised as well, and how much that context plays into how these decisions are made. Because like we know there's a bit of a pattern, and a lot of people have spoken about it, where it's a lot harder to stay at number one than it is to get to number one. And I'm wondering whether the context of striving and trying to reach this kind of ultimate pinnacle goal allows us to be more resilient, because there's a mental context which says do whatever it takes, irrespective. Like, I'll chop off my left arm to win, sort of thing. But maybe the context changes, and I don't know. This might be a controversial concept, or it might be just very reasonable. But maybe it's actually harder to continue to endure pain and suffering when you're already there, because the luxuries of life are there, and it's not going to harm you if you don't participate in something that you're used to. I know just aging, as a kid, I would do anything and everything, and you just say, let's go, pack up and go to the coast. And now you're like, no, I've got to bring all my luxuries, and I've got to make sure everything's perfect and put it all together. It becomes a big saga, and say, oh, to hell with it, we're not doing that either.
Yeah.
It's almost like the resilience has gone out the more comfortable I get, and maybe that's what happens in the context of comfort. Maybe there's other contexts that I'm not considering, that, I've got a whole lot of other responsibilities, so I don't want any more. But it's fascinating to look at, is any of this driven by that context of, if I've already achieved so much, do I want to put myself through this? So maybe it's not even a question of resilience, but rather a question of, do I need to? If life's comfortable enough, I'm not showing up to the interview. I don't know. Just a thought.
Yeah, I think it's interesting line of thought there, and I think a couple of things come to mind around that context. And you would get this all the time in your practice, right? Around context being anchors for how we see the world, and the context can really, a bit like us being in a boat, right? Imagine us, though one day we might do this, Nesh, we might actually be able to travel again and be able to go on the Mediterranean and have a yacht there and put an anchor down. And when you do that and you look at the view, and it's great, right? It really is amazing, and it's exciting, and it's wonderful. But day 4 of seeing the same view, you perhaps want to release that anchor and maybe go around the bay a little bit and put the yacht there, right? And kind of enjoy that view for a little while. And I think in a lot of ways...
Which is fascinating, because in so many ways, if we're just looking at the two photos, they look so similar, right? It's just we look for variation, for difference. 4 days of the same stimulus becomes boring.
Yes, absolutely. And so that context, I think, is interesting. How we set up those anchors in our minds can really change. So, for example, aspiring to become the best at what you do, if you want to become the best physician, if you want to become the best psychologist or the best leader and whatever it is, that journey of heading towards that path is really interesting. And I think there's a hunger and an ambition that sits along with that. I suspect that the level of hunger and ambition that is associated with staying at that level, because once you've hit number 1, there isn't anywhere higher really to go. I think that changes, right? That flips a switch in our minds, because it's no longer about, a path. And we are all driven to some extent by some sort of journey, right? Some sort of destination. It's hard to explain to someone the destination is stay where you are, right? Don't go anywhere else, right? Do not drop. I mean, we can't go up, so hit a glass ceiling, but don't go down, right? That is not so inspirational, motivational, I don't think, for someone who has had to demonstrate an immense amount of hunger and ambition all their lives. Right? It's almost counterintuitive to them. And I think a lot of players love the fact, in some sick way, that they might drop from being number 1 at what they do, because then it gives them another reason to fight back, right? And so you see this all the time. You see that with players coming back from injury. I mean, you don't have to look far. Even in tennis, Andy Murray for example, the way that he's come back from numerous injuries in his life. And that hunger and ambition to achieve that, is phenomenal. And so, sport is one thing, but we see it all the time in business. We see it in our day-to-day lives. We see the single mum who has to fight for her job, who has to look after the kids, who has to manage a household under massive restrictions. We see it all the time around us. And I think when we do get to that comfort, I think that word is a really interesting word that you use, because comfort triggers so many different emotions, right? The thought of comfort. And so then, as you and I know, that thought then, those feelings then generate a whole bunch of behaviors that we then resonate with. And so, why do I need to pack those bags for that trip anymore? I've already done that. I've been there. I'd rather just put my feet up and have a nice beverage, right? That's how I'm going to enjoy this weekend. So context plays a big role in that. So hunger, and I think almost when you change that anchor or that context, it does give us a different perspective, and that's really interesting.
It's kind of like the hunger that we have in ourselves. If I borrow from the analogy of parking the boat and then moving it, I might say I want some pizza tonight, but continued pizza. It's not that I am no longer hungry. I'm just not hungry for pizza. I don't want pizza four nights in a row. I'm hungry for something else, and maybe that's what assists in that resilience of being able to change, whether it's the anchor in your own mind about what something represents, because potentially you could be doing the same thing, but it's representing something different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Versus having to actually change what you're doing. That might be a harder pivot to keep doing the same thing and change it in your mind than, for example, changing jobs and feeling like it's fresh and it's new, and we tell ourselves a narrative that we're learning more or something or other. And, maybe sometimes we are and maybe sometimes we're not.
And I think it's an interesting one with our careers, the choices that we make around finding a job, right? And how we go about doing that. And, when I speak to a lot of job seekers, one of the things that I always hear is that, I feel like I've missed the boat. I've gotten comfortable in my job. I know exactly how the organization works. My brand is already established in this business or this government agency or wherever it might be. And therefore, for me to then make that change, there has to be, it requires firstly a massive amount of energy from me to be able to do that. Where else could I park that energy that's going to be helping me and giving me some enjoyment, right? And so without a plan of getting there, it's very difficult to see what the benefit would be of changing jobs, moving into a different agency or a different organization, even moving country, right? And so, that sort of calibration almost, right, that needs to take place in our mind is interesting. And I kind of liken it to, I remember I was in Abu Dhabi to watch this particular magician, a guy called David Blaine. I don't know if you've come across David Blaine. Is this master illusionist. He's the guy that hangs up in a box for 24 days, no food, no water, just survives, right? He does these kind of weird kind of escape sort of tricks. Anyway, he was performing and he came down the stage and he sat down and did this card trick right in front of us, right? And it was phenomenal. I was thinking, I'm never going to be this close to an illusionist like this. But the greatest illusionist sits up in our heads, right? And they're working 24/7. They're just constantly creating these illusions for us. And we get to pick and choose actually what those illusions are, right? Now, some of those illusions can be helpful for us. It gets us in the right mindset and the right frame of mind. Others can be disastrous. And, I think we've seen some of that more recently. I don't know if you saw that report from Lifeline Australia a couple of days ago that said they had the busiest day ever in their recorded history, right, of calls, 3,400 calls in a day. And so there's a lot of people right now that need an ability to be able to help them with their mindset, right? I don't think there's been a busier time for psychologists, Nesh. I'd imagine you're pretty busy at the moment.
Yeah, just a touch. I'll tell you what, though, like everyone says you guys must be very busy. I think the truth is psychology has had a shortage for a long time, so it actually doesn't change it as a psychologist. It just changed the number of calls and the number of people we have on our waiting list because we're just not able to physically see more people.
Yes.
So, interesting for us, no change, but for the community, extreme change, that they can't be seen, certainly not in any reasonable time. So they're left to look at other avenues. And I think it's a real, problem on a societal sort of perspective and a global perspective, because we're not alone in that either. Where do people go out and get that support? And really, if we're going to be reasonable and honest and look at it, I think in a conscious way, we shouldn't be just looking at how to work in our mindset with professionals. Psychologists should not be placed on a pedestal, or psychiatry or GPs or medication or anything. They are one part of a very complex thing called, our mental states or our psyche or our beliefs and so on and so forth. And yes, we're valuable in what we do, but we can't be dependent on it either, because in situations like this, where you can't see a specific professional, or in other situations where maybe you do become dependent on your psychologist. And I know that, we work very, very hard to stop that from occurring. Because it's a natural thing to happen as well. But we're busy, but this hasn't changed it. Unfortunately, it's just the community is in a world hurt with obviously the COVID lockdowns and what that means for people's livelihoods and contact and sense of belonging and connection and all the numerous things that I can't even begin to even conceive what problems come from this.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of things I think over the next, sort of 2 to 5 years, we're going to see surfacing, right, through this. And, it's interesting you're mentioning about, our sort of mindset becoming, interdependent on this system or a collective of approaches, right, that help us as individuals. And I've been playing around with this idea of this self map, right? The idea that, you might have this sort of view, each of us have a view of ourselves, right? And how we operate. And it is obviously constructed of, some core things that are important to us. And this pandemic, I think, has really brought out a number of interesting observations. And I'll give you one in particular that I find fascinating, which is how we have interchanged isolation with loneliness, right? And the idea that if you are isolated, that you are therefore lonely. And that is simply not true, right? And so in our minds, we have equated those two things. There's a belief that if I'm locked away and I can't get out of my house and have that freedom to do the things that I want to do, that I'm lonely. Now, you and I know that there are lots of people out there sometimes who go to the extreme and even take their own lives, who will actually talk about their sense of loneliness. And they are some of the most charismatic, gregarious, extroverted individuals who are constantly surrounded by people, right? And so those two things are completely separate entities. But for whatever reason, we have managed to focus on one particular part of our value set, exaggerated that so that then becomes a threat to our entire self-identity, right? And so it's almost breaking down some of these things in our own minds to say, well, what is actually the problem? Okay, I'm in my house. I'm feeling lonely, right? What can I do, right, to kind of do that? In sports psychology, we call it controlling the controllables, right? What is in my control that I can actually exert some influence over? Can I get onto a WhatsApp video chat? Can I, start actually interacting more with my family or my friends or other people? Can I talk across the fence to my neighbor, right, and set up a chat, right? What are the things that are possible, that we can do? And that level of independence, is really critical. And so when we sort of look at frameworks around mental toughness and resilience, that life control, we call it life control. Am I the driver of my destiny, or am I the passenger? Right? That sort of reminder, is so important. Nesh, I can tell you, there's not a day that goes by that I don't remind myself of this. Right? I mean, we run a business where we've got different projects happening in different countries. Inevitably, something's not going well. Right? Something's going to go off. Right? Clients want more. An associate wasn't able to deliver on time. There is something happening. Right? And there are a lot of things out of my control, as there are for a lot of us. And if I was to focus on those things, it would truly be devastating, right? And so I've had to come up with my own system, right, of being able to deal with this, which was literally to have a mantra of what is in my control. What can I do about this? I can't control the economy. I can't control the spread of the COVID Delta virus. I can't dictate policy to Scott Morrison about what should be happening around vaccination protocol, right? What I can do is a whole bunch of other things. And as a result of that, and I think people who tend to perform at higher levels, there is a very consistent thread around the choice of that mindset, right? And, it's not an accident that people who perform at higher levels consistently do this more than other people. And in fact, there's
one thing that I would add, sorry, Gaj, to jump in. One thing I would add there is, in listening to you talk about that, this isn't something that you know on a rational front. This is something that you have adopted as a part of your fabric. There's a belief, almost like a blind faith in that, and trying to use different words to kind of say it's fully immersed in that. And because of that immersion, it's not a theoretical idea. It's something you just know. And that knowingness kind of allows you to say, go back to what you can control, that high internal locus of control. And
that sense of
that
attribution
allows you to just pivot, so to speak, or whatever language. And so whatever comes your way, I suppose your radar, your mental sort of lens goes out and says, I'm not going to see the negative of it. I'll look for the solution, which is the control. There's always something you can control. There's almost like the belief, what can I control? How can we fix this? How can we prevent this from happening again, so on and so forth. It's kind of in your nature. Is this well, maybe nature's not the right word. Is this something that you have to work on, or is it part of your nature? Is it, part of the high conscientiousness or with some other features?
I think I'm glad you used the word features as opposed to other things, but I think it definitely wasn't something I was born with. This wasn't my natural style by no stretch of the imagination. In fact, I would say I'm quite naturally an anxious individual, and I've had to teach myself, right, how to manage that anxiety in a way that was going to be helpful and healthy for me, because I could see that in a lot of ways earlier on in my life, it was very unhealthy. And so as a result of that, whether it was growing up and having these imposter experiences in different things, being given roles when I was young that I felt I was too young for, right? And why are people trusting in me, to do this? And I'm going to get up in front of 300 CEOs and have this conversation. They're all 25 years older than me. What am I going to tell them, right? That still happens, right? And in fact, what I tell myself is I'm glad that it happens because it keeps me honest. It keeps me grounded. It keeps me working harder, right? Because there are things that I then need to do to lift my game, right? So that people who do have an experience with me or with people in my team, they get something positive out of that, right? And so, turning that around. In fact, I was in a class. This is a couple of years ago now, a year 2 class, listening to a teacher getting a bunch of kids to stand up and do a little mini presentation, right? And they had this beautiful way of explaining how to turn these kids and their anxiety as they were getting up and speaking into something really positive. And so the teacher, this child, was about 7 or 8 years old, stood up and was shaking. I mean, the paper they were holding was just shaking. And the teacher said to them, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No, I'm scared." Right? I said, "Oh, what are you feeling?" I said, "Well, I've got all these butterflies that are going crazy in my stomach, right? That's how I feel." And the teacher said, "Well, what if those butterflies were flying in a pattern that you could see, right? How would that make you feel?" And so after a few minutes, the child went and sat down and then came back up again. And it was amazing to see that transition. It was in a couple of minutes, Nesh. And to see a bit of a smile come through this child's face who was previously horrified at having to do this. Now, that simple connection between our mind and body that can dictate how we behave was so powerful. And I think it's something that we're getting better at teaching in our schools. I know that mental health is something that we're talking about a lot at the moment in different schools. But that's something that we forget in moments of chaos and anxiety, right? That we are in a position to be able to do this. And I find that fascinating, that for whatever reason, the ability for us to control goes into a black hole. What is it about that situation where we forget that we are actually also an active participant in all of this, right? Not a victim of what is happening to our context or situation. And so, I see this all the time with people who lose their jobs. How I started off as a psych was actually going and helping organizations to have the redundancy interviews and conversations, right? It was the ugly version of the George Clooney in Up in the Air, right? That was my job. And part of that was really about, how do you take someone from arguably their lowest point in their professional career to be able to think positively and have a plan about where they're going to go. And I've been doing that for the last 20 years, and I can tell you it's not an accident that the people who tend to find jobs that they want to be in and at a faster rate, right, a more efficient rate, are the ones that commit to the process, right, in a complete way. They have a positive mindset around the things that they want to try. They try new things. They're willing to take risks. They're willing to try and expand their network and have uncomfortable conversations, right, with people. They are more willing to accept that they are in control of their destiny, and that the employment market and the fact that we're in a COVID state is not the dictator for that. And also that they believe in themselves, right? And for me, that confidence is one of the biggest factors, right? And, using facts to remind ourselves of what is actually happening. We can very easily just divert back to feelings as opposed to going back to our thoughts and what we think about situations. So, and it's not an accident that the people who embrace those concepts tend to find work faster and also have much more success in terms of the opportunities and the time frame at which they find those jobs. Right? Yeah.
It's interesting because sometimes, we might misunderstand resilience in looking at an example like that, where we might say the person who transitions quicker and faster is more resilient. Yet it might be just their nature that they kind of look at it. And maybe that is a part of resilience. The other side of me kind of thinks about how you defined it earlier in our conversation about, continuing to do those, things that are important irrespective of the environment, something like that. Apologies if I've poorly rephrased what you said. But there could be the other person who is really up against it, that it's not their skill set to go out and, stand up in front of the classroom and tell their story and present. It's not their skill set to go out and contact people and ask for a job and do some networking and kind of, embrace the change. But resilience in could be about how someone transitions irrespective of what they're facing. Just for some, they don't need much resilience because it's kind of easy for them. They're like, oh, well, this place is, probably come to an end for me anyway. They come up with some sort of narrative as to why, it's time for them to move on. And they're like, yeah, fresh new start. Have a chat with their partner when they get home, and they kind of are not too phased. And they're like, this is actually pretty good. You don't get a redundancy too often. I'll get my package and and
yeah, I'll take some time off. We'll spend time with the kids and go on a holiday. And yeah, absolutely.
As with someone else got to do some heavy lifting at that point where it feels like their world has fallen apart, or they actually need to do some incredible, serious retraining, and it's and they have to put in a huge volume of effort to be able to be reinstated in a like for like job, lots of different contexts, but or scenarios. But it kind of dawned on me that it kind of almost feels like one person's more resilient, but are they? Or is it just maybe is resilience a capacity to just cope with adversity?
Yeah, and maybe because if we keep thinking about resilience as an outcome, that's not really what resilience is, right? It's the journey that you take to get there, and it's the steps that you take, and it's the narrative that you tell yourself, right? You're absolutely right. It's we are master storytellers, and we're constantly telling ourselves stories. Sometimes they're horror scripts, and sometimes they're romantic, and sometimes they're comedies and whatever, right? So I completely agree with you that I think it is more journey related. When you think about that resilience path, it is, for me, that resilience journey is not just about, dealing with that adversity. It's also about what you choose to do next, right? Now, all of us can do something next, right? And that next doesn't need to be, I'm going to go to work tomorrow and resign and take 3 months off, right? It could be for some people, right? That's something that they want to do, right? For others, it might be, I need to actually go through a process of starting with 2 of my best mates. I'm going to talk to them about the fact that I'm thinking about leaving, and I'm going to ask them to introduce me to 2 people. That's it. So it's a warm lead, right? It's not even I'm going to go and meet new people that I've never spoken to before. So it's thinking through, what am I going to do next that is actually going to be healthy and helpful for me on this path? Because we can all do that, right? Some of it will be micro steps, and that's okay. Right, it's going in a positive direction, and I think for each of us, we do have to understand that journey for ourselves. And I find one of the
So just jumping in, is it maybe also an element of how we might gauge who's more resilient, who's less resilient? Is almost like how much someone is affected by, how much they care. Like it would look to me like scenario A, someone is made redundant and they don't care. And so they walk through that passage of time, which might be, 6 weeks by the time they find their next job, 12 weeks, with very little pain, well, not very little, but certainly much, much, much less pain and hurt and care. And the person who's less resilient might still have the exact same outcome. They get another job in 12 weeks' time, but they go through hell. They don't sleep well. They're stressed. They're disengaging from others. They're withdrawing. Maybe having more disputes. They're kind of worried. They're ruminating. Maybe resilience, just sort of talking it through, it popped up for me is about how much someone cares. How much they're affected. That whatever their mental narrative is. One is like, she'll be right. That good old Aussie slang sort of, she'll be right. Versus the, oh my God, how could they do this to me and kind of be stuck in that space for an extended period of time and feeling unfair and hurt and all the other reasonable things as well, but maybe show less resilience.
So I think it's an interesting point. And what does the research tell us, right? So the research tells us that the individuals that choose the narrative, right, that is actually helpful to move one step forward are better off, right? So if we choose the narrative that this is painful, that this is going to be torture, This is going to be taking me into a place that is unhealthy for me, right? Absolutely. That journey is not going to be worth taking. And so every day is painful. But the individuals that construct a narrative that is actually positively focused, right? That is achievable in their minds, that results in them also understanding, and I think resilience, this is a big part of resilience that is coming through now in the research, is around the support network that you create around you, right? The idea that you do have people there to help you on this journey, that you are not doing this on your own, right? is so critical as well. So I think there's that element, absolutely. The other part, which I think you were kind of alluding to there, is also this sense of comparison, right? And looking at other people and you know, that being a benchmark for you. I think single-handedly, Nesh, this is one of the worst things that we can be doing to ourselves. When we look at other people and we compare ourselves to them, you know, why did they move through that so quickly? How come they're so happy going through this? That creates a massive amount of discrepancy and destabilizing, right, in our own minds. And that, as we all know, with anything that creates instability, can lead to...
You always come up inferior because you can always find someone who's doing it better than you are. Yeah.
Yeah. And the idea of comparing means that someone is losing in that comparison.
Yes,
so
yes.
Either we are happy because we were beating them, or we are happy, or we are sad because they're better than us, right?
And if you're winning today, tomorrow you'll be losing. So, you know, that's the lure, that you grab it when it's feeling good, but you don't realize what you're grabbing is future pain.
Yes. And so that is, you know, a fundamental part of all of this, which means, okay, if that is not going to be necessarily so healthy for me, then I have to travel inward, right, to be able to have this journey. And so that means, what am I managing in my thoughts, which are affecting the feelings and then the behavior, right? So what am I going to tell myself? What's the story and the narrative that I want to tell myself every day when I wake up, right? And so this is where the idea of gratitude and mindfulness and all of these things, you know, resonate with people, right? Because it is an inward journey, you know, around that, because comparison is exceptionally unhealthy. We know this. But we do it because we think we're playing some sort of game or a competition. And so as a result of that, the rules are that I have to beat somebody. Well, that's really not the rules anymore. That's not how the world operates in the way that we think about things. Even if we look at the world of work and the way that we're moving from this, you know, gig economy into this fractional employment, right? The idea that, you know, over the next 5 to 10 years, employers are probably going to be not advertising permanent full-time positions as much, right? So this is a big mindset shift for people, that we are going to have to think about the idea that there are probably going to be multiple part-time jobs that we might need to take on. And that's going to be potentially how we all operate, right? It's taking the gig economy to another level of outcome, right? Now, we're seeing this in the US already. All right, that employers have realized that, if we're going to be working from home, or if we're going to be, you know, I can be employing someone based out of the Philippines or India or somewhere else to do this job, and they can do it part-time for me. I don't necessarily need to have a full-time headcount sitting in this country, right? And so it is connecting the world, but it is also creating some complications for people who want immense stability and permanence, right, in their lives. Now, if those contexts are changing around us, and that is out of our control in lots of ways, we go back to what's in our control, right? And so is it about, how do I equip myself with the skills to be an attractive brand to employers, right? So if I know that I've got to have 2 or 3 gigs that I've got to be working on over the next 5 to 10 years, or working towards that, maybe I need to become less reliant on my current permanent role that I'm thinking about, because the employer might turn around and say to me one day, actually, you know, I think that this role is probably part-time, right? And we can probably get this done part-time working from home somewhere, right? And so there's all of that then impacts people's mindset as well. And it should create more independence in ourselves, right? That we need to go out and find these opportunities and do this. Now, that is a completely different skill set that we need to be creating in ourselves, right? So it's interesting to see how we're going to be migrating and transitioning, towards that. But it all starts with the story that we tell ourselves. What is that narrative?
Is that also maybe a feature of when there is enough supply of work out there that there's greater selectiveness, so you can pick, do a few days here. I mean, psychology is very much in this space at the moment where there's certainly not enough graduates coming out. And so you see many more psychologists doing part-time roles, rather than, your full-time roles. And I don't know if that's across the board everywhere, but it certainly has been what I've observed. Is that a feature of abundance, or, that there's so much available, so we can kind of pick and choose? Is it an economic thing that if you're getting paid well enough, you don't necessarily have to do full-time load? Or maybe there's people who are doing two part-time jobs that equates to more than a full-time role. I mean, I don't know what the data is out there, but what do you see here in Australia, and or even in other countries? How are you seeing that sort of space?
Well, we're definitely seeing a shift away from that sense of permanency. And I think organizations, even if you took a purely economic view on this, right, the idea that you would have to be fixed on one employee to do a job, and that they are fully utilized, right, all the time to be able to do that. And particularly if they're working from home, right, where all of a sudden an employer, and we've heard some of the investment banks, coming out over the last few months saying everyone needs to be back in the office. Right? They can't handle a world where they are not in control, right, of their employees, right? And, when that happens, and you don't necessarily have control over employees, you don't know what everyone's doing. As long as the output is the same, well, do we need to pay someone full-time to do that? Maybe we could pay them part-time to get the same output, right? So there's pressures that are happening from an economic perspective, but there's also this sense of, the statistics on the amount of graduates who are not choosing to go into the corporate world over the last 5 years is staggering. We've seen a 25% increase, right, in graduates choosing to go down the entrepreneurial path, right, rather than going into graduate positions. This is globally, this is happening, right? That is significant. That means there is the compelling case, right, for employers to offer these graduate programs, to say, come and work for us. We're going to teach you how to be the best graduate that you can be and the best employee of ours, is not compelling enough, right? It means that individuals and young graduates are probably finding that what they're learning from being an entrepreneur or joining a young startup or whatever it might be is so much more enriching, right, to their skill set. Gives them more flexibility, perhaps, right, to choose other ventures and other things. That sense of autonomy, that sense of creativity that we are tapping into, we've never had this in the history of mankind, right? These kind of opportunities. So it is all new, but the research is clear. And the fact that, graduates are deselecting out of that traditional process is a very good indication that the market is shifting. Right. Yeah.
It poses a different question, I suppose, of the resilience of what companies need to do, that the old model of, having a graduate program is, as you say, not compelling enough, that it's not stimulating enough. It doesn't provide, whatever it is that graduates are looking for in whatever industry that we're talking about. It needs to capture them and give them more juice. That, that's what we're kind of looking for. It's very, very fascinating to kind of see, because that taps into our resilience as well about, what am I willing to ask for? What do I want? And how willing am I to punt or take a risk? Do I see it as a risk or not? What other luxuries have I got, around? Do I have those responsibilities that I've got to carry that maybe makes me less resilient to change?
Yes.
Absolutely. There's so much complexity in that space. in that space.
And the conversations that you and I might have had growing up around, getting a house and having a mortgage, right? Getting married and having kids, doing all these things doesn't seem to come up as often as early as it did for us. I mean, we're not talking about 100-year time difference here. We're talking about 15 to 20 years, right? That things have shifted so much that the priorities of people aren't necessarily the same anymore. And I'm talking, obviously generally, right? So this is a bit of a general thing. Of course. But as a result of that, employers also need to attune to the fact that, well, if we want to give our young talent more freedom and flexibility, how could we set up the structures so that, you know what, we're going to hire you part-time. You can go and do whatever else you want, but we want you for 25 hours a week, right? Because we want your brilliance, we want your creativity, we want your dynamism in this firm, right? But we also appreciate that you don't want to just give it to one party, right? There's going to be other people involved. What an attractive proposition that would be to a bunch of young people who are not thinking about, I need to get money together for a deposit on a house, right, to buy a mortgage, because I want to be free to make those choices, right? So I think employers also gearing themselves up around that shift is really interesting, and how they do that over the next 5 to 10 years is going to be critical.
Maybe younger people are getting more resilient because they just don't care about that. I'll deal with that later when I need to. I'm not concerned, that I'm not dependent, and I can hold that, really loosely and lightly in my head. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful way to be thinking, absolutely. An older person might say, yeah, but you need to do your responsibilities. And maybe a younger person says, hey, I'll get there.
I will do it, but probably not right now.
Of lives, we're getting, lifespan's getting older and older. For every 2 years that passes, I believe we're adding a year of aging. So, extending our lifespan globally. So, maybe that comes with it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I get reminded by my girls all the time. They're 15 and 12. About how old I actually am, right? And particularly in my mindset around the freedom that they want to have. So I think it's fascinating. And again, it's the narrative, right? We go back to the storytelling in our minds. Yeah.
Where can people find out more about the work you do, and also maybe tell us a little bit about your workplace? And I know that you're currently in Sydney, but there's office in Dubai as well. Tell us a little bit about that space and where people can connect with you, find out more about you, and reach out.
Yeah, sure. So we set up a business in 2013. This is called Kompass, that was headquartered out of Dubai. Dubai, geographically, for those of you who've been there, it's a wonderful place to access different parts of the world. And so we focus on career, leadership, and performance. They're the three core elements of what we do, individuals, but also in teams and organizations. We do some work with sporting teams and athletes as well, but also with business schools, so executive MBA and MBA businesses. And resilience and mental toughness cuts across all of those areas, right? So that's the beauty of that work, that all of us need those core skills and the perspective on life around those concepts to help us to be able to achieve. And so actually, this time last year, we created a virtual product to kind of help people around the career side, because we realized, we were seeing some statistics coming out of the amount of millions of people losing their jobs through what was happening. And so we decided to create this program called Kickstarter. And that is a series of, 8 videos, 4 hours in length, that basically give you the tools, sample CVs, interview guides, negotiations, salary negotiation techniques, to help people to be able to deal with, either finding a new job because you might be out of a job, or if you wanted to transition right into a new role. So whether you're a graduate all the way through to senior ranks, the tools and techniques in there we've used with tens of thousands of people around the world to help them to make those transitions. And so I think, all of us are trying to do things, to help. In fact, we've given that product, if anyone there is a veteran, it is free for you. right, to access. And so you can simply find me on either LinkedIn or Instagram. I think I have to be on Instagram these days, otherwise I'm irrelevant, supposedly, I'm being told. Or through our website at Compass with a K, compassconsultancy.com. And we're very happy to support and help people any way we can. That's why we set this firm up.
It's fantastic. I think this word of resilience is so important for individuals, for groups, for organizations, just to have the conversation. I think we often are so narrow-minded of just thinking this is what it is, or this is what it is, and it's about just hardening up and just shut up and get on with it, and or whatever it might be, or it's these judgments between comparisons and you go that person's resilient versus that person's not. And I think this conversation has certainly opened up for me how many layers and contextual features we've got to consider in trying to understand what it is, and I feel I have much more clarity and confusion after this that it poses just as many questions as we've kind of maybe explored and I won't say solved, but explored and dabbled around in. But I think to be able to do that on an organizational front would be amazing, because it means different things for different people, and it doesn't necessarily just mean the traditional way that resilience might be considered. So it's been extremely insightful for me, and I'd encourage everyone everyone listening who thinks they could benefit from those conversations, further exploration on a personal or professional front, organizational front, to go to the website, have a look around, but look at any level and see how it applies, because these conversations have to keep going. That's the way to keep our eye on the ball as well, because we just keep discovering. I'm sure you're learning all the time as well, just because you're in it and thinking about it, and hence big appreciation for you coming onto the show and giving us a bit of insight in that space as well.
Thank you, Nesh. I really love what you do, mate, and bringing these conversations to people, and people need them right now more than ever. And I think this is so critical that we can just tap these kind of conversations in, with a couple of taps, and we're into some knowledge. And I think you're right. We've opened up probably some questions that hopefully we get to think about and talk about publicly with people much more freely than we might have in the past, and it becomes acceptable for us, to have these discussions. And it's not a sign of weakness, right, to have that. And I think that's so important as well. Yeah.
I'm reading a book at the moment I think it's called The Fearless Organization.
Right.
And it's really about just people, a cultural sort of feel of people feeling not afraid to raise these things, not afraid to talk about their own personal, lives matters, complexities in the workplace, why a deadline hasn't been, met. It's just having frank conversations, but without fear. And resilience sort of comes to mind. In that is that resilience, is also the confidence one has to go out and maybe reach out to an organization like yours and say, this isn't a criticism on ourselves. This is actually us wanting to learn more and understand this space better and maybe integrate some things. So, I hope we've started that conversation for our listeners and continue to explore that for ourselves as well. And once again, appreciate you coming onto the show and offering your expertise and knowledge.
Thank you, Nesh. Appreciate it, mate. And hope to catch up again soon, maybe in person.
Well, look, I'll tell you what, when these lockdowns, end, maybe I'll come up to Sydney, or you come down to Canberra, and maybe I'll come up. It's a bit warmer. We'll have a coffee.
That'll be great. Thanks, mate.
See ya. If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.